Aliens horrified that a Deathworld girl doesn't need weapons to win. The station's ceramic decking smelled like coolant and someone else's dread. Orvin Tail noticed this the way he noticed most things, as data, filed and cross-referenced against previous assessments. The smell had always been there. It was the smell of pretrial mornings. What changed today was the second entry in his cohort log. He read it twice. Non-combatant, reassignment advised. Drevath had filed before the trial began, before Orvin had even finished his coffee. The timestamp was 6:04 station time. The trial was scheduled for 800. That was, Orvin thought, efficient, even by Koltari standards. He set the slate down on his terminal and looked through the observation glass at the staging corridor below. The pretrial area held the usual arrangement: weapons racked to the left, medical kits sealed and waiting, the ceramic mat stretching out to the arena floor where a kill-rated Koltari fighter was already warming up. Grevak. Orvin had read his file too. 14 trials, no losses, 4 medical retrieval events, all opposing. None involving Grevak personally. Grevak did not require retrieval. A human girl had just walked into the staging area. She was not looking at the weapons rack. She was not looking at Grevak through the far viewing glass. She was looking at nothing in particular while she reached into a small kit bag and pulled out a roll of binding tape, off-white, worn at the edges. She sat down on the staging bench and began wrapping her hands with the focused, unhurried attention of someone performing a morning ritual they had done so many times it no longer required thought. Each finger, each knuckle, the wrist. Orvin made a note. No weapon selected, possible misunderstanding of trial parameters, follow-up post-assessment. He believed at the time that this was the correct interpretation. Stay close. What I saw next changed everything I thought I understood about what a weapon is. Lieutenant Korath arrived at the observation gallery with 2 cups of filtered water and the expression of someone who had already made peace with the outcome. "She's not going to ask for a lance," Korath said. The attendant offered. Orvin took one of the cups. She declined. Korath watched through the glass for a moment. The girl had finished the right hand and started on the left. She was working at the same pace, not faster, not slower. The non-combatant designation was already filed. At 0604. Drevath is thorough. Yes, Orvin looked back at his slate. He thought about the other number he had read this morning, the one from the station's overall assessment record. He was going to have to say it out loud eventually. He preferred to have Korath sitting down when he did. I reviewed the general cohort medical log for context. Korath sat. The arena has a 41% medical retrieval rate across all assessed species. A pause, all species. All species, 240 assessed, 98 retrievals. Orvin picked up his stylus. The rate accounts for the fact that several species have natural armament that reduces injury frequency. Koltari exoskeletal fighters, for instance, have a lower-than-average personal retrieval rate. They are, however, the primary cause of the retrieval events for their opponents. Korath looked at the glass again. The girl had finished her left hand and was examining the result. She flexed her fingers once. Then she set the tape roll down on the bench beside her and stood up. She left the tape roll on the bench. Orvin noted this too, though he could not have said why it seemed like information. Submarshal Drevath's voice came through the gallery speakers, the formal commencement address, delivered without Drevath having to look up from his terminal. Orvin had been in enough cohort trials to know the man never stood for the opening announcement. Trial parameters as follows: species assessment, human Earth origin, biological survey on record, natural armament absent, subdermal plating absent, toxin glands absent, mass index 62% of Koltari baseline, recorded combat lineage in coalition database none, a brief pause, threat classification filed at 0604, non-combatant, reassignment advised, trial purpose, assessment confirmation. He cleared his throat. The next part was standard. I want to note that the Pinnacle Station Combat Evaluation Board takes the safety of all assessed personnel seriously. The trial is designed to confirm classification, not to produce harm. Medical personnel are on standby. Orvin thought about the 41%. He did not say this. Trial commenced. Grevak entered from the far tunnel. He was wearing partial ceremonial plating, the ridged exoskeletal pieces that the Koltari added to their natural armor for formal assessments, a tradition that dated back to the founding of the Coalition's combined training program. His electrified lance was in his right hand's middle pair. The tip hummed at a frequency Orvin could feel in his back teeth even through the observation glass. He had estimated the voltage once. He had stopped estimating voltages after that. Grevak was 310 kilograms. He was also the polite one. His mandibles did the slow click pattern that Orvin had learned meant amusement in his species, a low, unhurried sound, almost pleasant, not unkind, simply confident. The girl was already standing on the mat. Her feet were at an odd angle, wider than standard, offset weight distribution that did not map to any combat stance Orvin had in his reference library. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her face was calm in the particular way that Orvin, a tactical analyst who had spent 11 cycles reading threat responses, could not categorize. It was not the calm of someone suppressing panic. It was the calm of someone who had already decided what she was going to do and found the decision unremarkable. She said something. The arena mic caught it. The tape on my hands is just a habit. I wasn't sure how rough your mats were. Korath made a sound. Orvin wrote it down. He watched Grevak raise the lance. The voltage was visible now, a blue-white shimmer along the length of the shaft, bright enough that Orvin could see it from the gallery. Grevak held it at the guard position his species had used for 600 years, weight forward, 3 of 4 arms engaged, the motion already committed to the specific geometry of advancing on a target that had not moved. The girl had not moved. She watched the lance come up. She watched Grevak begin his approach, the long, ground-eating stride of a Koltari in formal engagement, 300 kilograms of plated muscle accelerating toward a single fixed point. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her feet stayed in that odd, offset position. She looked, Orvin thought, like she was waiting for a corridor to clear. Grevak committed. What happened next took 19 seconds. Orvin was not going to describe it well. He had tried later in the formal assessment report, and what he had written was technically accurate but seemed to be describing a different event from the one he had watched. What his eyes registered was this. Her hand found the lance shaft just below the electrified tip, not gripping it, which would have been lethal, but redirecting it, a small shift that used Grevak's own forward momentum as the mechanical agent. Her body rotated. The rotation was the wrong shape for a vertebrate species. It was too far, in a direction that did not correspond to any of the joint articulation diagrams in the Koltari defensive manual or to any of the species adaptation records Orvin had access to. Grevak's leg went, not from a strike, from the geometry being wrong, from the weight being somewhere it was not supposed to be, and then somewhere else, and then the floor being the only remaining option. 310 kilograms of armored Koltari hit the ceramic deck. The sound was a cargo container dropped from height. Orvin's 3 hearts did something they had not done in 4 cycles. They synced, not staggered, 2 beat and 1 beat, their normal rhythm, but simultaneous, all 3 firing at the same moment in what his species called the convergence. Under normal circumstances, the convergence produced poor decisions and excellent reports. Under these circumstances, it produced a small, involuntary sound from Orvin's scales, a dry click, barely audible. Korath said nothing. 19 seconds. The girl stood in the center of the mat. She looked down at Grevak. Then she bent, extended her hand, the wrapped one, off-white tape still clean, and waited. Grevak stared at the hand for a long moment. He made a sound Orvin could not classify. Then he took it. She pulled him up. Orvin sat with this detail for a while. He was still sitting with it when Drevath's voice came back through the speakers, not from standing, not from turning around, just a flat administrative update delivered to the gallery. Anomalous result. Retest recommended. Orvin looked at his slate. The classification was still there, still time-stamped 604, non-combatant, reassignment advised. The tape roll was still on the staging bench. She had not picked it up. He wrote, Specialist Hale did not retrieve her tape roll after the trial. Reason, unclear. He did not know why he included that. He included it anyway. The boarding alarm came 4 days later. Orvin was at his terminal when it hit 3 short tones and then the flat, procedural voice of the station's emergency system announcing hull breaches at 3 points on the lower ring. Research wing, storage corridor, docking interface 7. He had his tactical overlay up before the 3rd tone finished. Syndicate, Vreth-class shock units, the overlay said, biomechanical, hive-coordinated. The research wing breach was the problem. Dr. Veleth's xenobiology lab was in the research wing. The lab had active dampening fields, standard protocol for live specimen work, and those fields were going to make this complicated. Plasma output at 30% inside the field radius, Korath said from the door, already in gear. I know, Orvin was already moving. Tell the unit to concentrate fire on single shield points. Sustained contact on one target, not distributed. The barriers will overload if we stay on one. And if they don't? Orvin did not answer this. He had read the Syndicate shock unit specifications. The barriers were rated for sustained fire from 2 standard-issue plasma rifles for approximately 4 minutes before the charge depleted. His unit had 6 rifles. The math was not encouraging, but it was math, and math was something he could work with. What he could not work with was the dampening field degrading his output to a fraction of standard at the exact moment they needed full power. He found Specialist Hale in the secondary corridor, already moving toward the research wing. She had her rifle out. This surprised him. He had expected her, after the arena, to have some kind of plan that did not involve a rifle. Then he thought about how that expectation had formed, and he felt briefly foolish. Specialist, he fell into step beside her. Research wing, dampening fields are active. I know, she said. I can hear the frequency shift in the ventilation. He did not know what to say to this. He filed it. The corridor approach to the research wing was 30 meters of open ceramic floor, 3 wall-mounted emergency lights, and nothing else. The Syndicate had placed 2 units at the far end. They were not behind cover because the Syndicate doctrine, Orvin understood, did not model situations where opponents would choose to advance rather than pin down and wait for the barriers to hold. His unit pinned down. He ordered sustained fire on the left barrier. The bolts scattered, reduced output, the dampening field doing exactly what it was designed to do to every energy-based system in range. The left barrier flickered but held. He checked his right. Saren was not where he had put her. He found her on the security feed, a secondary screen in his helmet display. She had moved into the open corridor, not running, walking almost with the same unhurried pace she had used when she wrapped her hands in the staging area. Her rifle was holstered. She had holstered it at some point in the last 40 seconds without him noticing. Hale, he said on the unit channel. Status. Working, she said. He watched the feed. The first Syndicate unit turned toward her, the biomechanical tracking system registering a heat signature moving into its engagement zone. Its barrier was still up. Orvin prepared to call her back. She stepped inside the barrier's range. The barrier was designed to deflect energy. She was not energy. The unit's threat response system, Orvin later established, took approximately 2 seconds to reclassify her from non-threat background element to active engagement target. In those 2 seconds, she had closed the remaining distance, found the joint articulation point on its left manipulator arm, and applied a controlled rotation that the unit's design specifications had not accounted for as a mechanical input. The first unit went down. The second adjusted targeting. She was already inside its range too. Orvin issued the order he had been holding, sustained fire, right barrier, single point. His unit's output was degraded to a fraction of standard. They held the fire on one spot. The barrier began to show stress fractures in its emission pattern. The second unit went down before the barrier did. He stared at the corridor for a moment. Both units were on the floor. Seren was standing in the open space between them, checking her rifle's charge indicator with the expression of someone verifying that they remembered to lock their quarters. "Corridor clear," she said. He wrote nothing. He had not yet decided what he was writing down. Inside the research wing, the problem was larger. 2 more breach points. The dampening field was playing chaos with his team's output, and the Syndicate had learned, or rather its hive coordination had adjusted, to hold position at angles that required either a sustained plasma focus or a direct contact solution. Direct contact was not, in Orvin's tactical doctrine, the preferred option. His doctrine assumed all threats were energy weapon vectors. His unit took positions at the lab's exterior corridor junction. 6 rifles, degraded output, 4 Syndicate units holding angles that his suppression fire could not reach without a geometry that did not exist. "I need them to move," Orvin said. "Give me 30 seconds, Seren said. He started counting. At 22, the nearest Syndicate unit rotated to track a new contact, Seren, who had moved along the wall to a position that apparently registered as higher priority than the junction. The unit stepped forward to close range. Orvin had a shot at its barrier from the new angle. He took it. Sustained. Korath joined him on the same point. The barrier held for 8 seconds, then dropped. Orvin put 3 bolts into the unit's central housing in the window before the barrier recharged. It went down. Not cleanly, it took 2 of the 3, but it went down. Meanwhile, Seren had dealt with the unit that had moved toward her. 28 seconds, she said. I counted 22. I was being generous. There was a quality to this that Orvin found, in the moment, slightly disorienting. He was coordinating suppression fire against biomechanical shock troops in an active breach event, and the human specialist he had assigned to support was correcting his count. He filed this alongside the tape roll and the corridor walk, and the expression she'd had on her face in the staging area, building a category for which he did not yet have a name. The other 2 units at the junction had repositioned. He could work with the new angles. He ordered fire. They reached Dr. Velith's lab in 11 minutes from the alarm. The doctor was behind her primary workstation, a wide, flat sequencer array that took up most of the rear wall and contained, Orvin knew, 6 months of xenobiological survey data that could not be reconstructed if disrupted. Velith herself was calm in the way of someone who had worked in specimen labs long enough that emergencies registered as procedural problems rather than existential ones. 2 more units, she said before Orvin could speak. Vent system, I heard them 3 minutes ago. She had tentacles, Dr. Velith, aquatic pressure musculature from a deep ocean origin species built for environments where everything was trying to crush her. She had used one of them to move a heavy specimen cabinet in front of the vent cover. Orvin looked at the cabinet. He revised his assessment of her threat tier upward by 2 categories. They'll go through the main door too, Seren said. She was looking at the door's frame, the edges specifically where the acid dissolution marks were fresh. The Syndicate had started on the lock housing before the corridor fight had redirected their coordination signal. Now that signal had realigned. The door would not last. How long? Orvin asked. Door first, Seren said. 40 seconds maybe, vent is already open. He looked at the vent. The cover the specimen cabinet had been pushed against had, while they were talking, shifted. 1 centimeter, then 2. Take the door, Seren said. I have the vent. The vent cover came off in one sharp movement. The Syndicate unit on the other side had apparently decided subtlety was no longer useful. Seren stepped into the confined space between the wall and the rear workstation bench without looking back at Orvin. He took the door. He ordered Korath to his left, maintained single-point sustained fire on the lock housing as the acid-dissolved door began to separate. His charge depleted faster than he wanted. He drew his ceremonial blade, the one he carried, because regulations required an officer to carry a blade in certain contexts, not because he had ever expected to use it. And when the door came open, he drove the blade into the joint seam of the first unit's left arm assembly and jammed the limb. It was not tactically impressive. He included it in his report for completeness. The second door unit was still active when the lab's suppression fire from Korath finally found the barrier drop point, 2 bolts down. Behind him, in the space between wall and bench, there was a sequence of sounds that his report would later describe as controlled contact, details consistent with close quarters positional holds applied in a confined environment. He had been facing the door. He had not seen it directly. When he turned around, 2 syndicate units were on the lab floor and Saren was standing at the workstation bench. She was checking her rifle charge indicator again. The sequencer array behind her was undisturbed. Every light on it was still green. "Sequencer is intact," she said. "I can see that," Orvin said. She looked at him. The expression on her face was the same one she had worn in the staging area, the same one she had worn while walking down the open corridor with her rifle holstered, the same one she had worn while offering her hand to Grevak. It was a baseline expression for her. He understood that now. It was simply how she looked. "You're going to file an anomalous result again," she said. Orvin thought about this. "Submarshal Drevath will file the anomalous result. I file the tactical assessment. What will your assessment say?" He was quiet for a moment. What it would say, if he wrote it accurately, was that 6 syndicate shock units rated for energy weapon engagements had been neutralized in a dampening field environment, where his unit's plasma output was running at 30%, and that the primary factor in the corridor and vent engagements had been a human specialist who had holstered her rifle by choice and operated in close quarters using techniques his reference library did not contain a category for. It would say that the sequencer array, containing 6 months of irreplaceable xenobiological data, was intact because she had been in the right position at the right time and had treated the confined space between a wall and a bench as an adequate operating environment. It would say that the arena trial, 19 seconds, 1 opponent, open floor, had apparently been representative of a considered level of effort proportional to the threat presented, not a ceiling. He was not certain he wanted to write that last line yet. It had implications he was still working through. "It will be accurate," he said. She nodded, satisfied with this, and turned to check the sequencer's secondary display. She had already moved on. He was still standing in the same place, holding a ceremonial blade that had 1 bent joint seam on a syndicate unit to its credit. Dr. Veleth moved the specimen cabinet back to its original position with 2 tentacles and the expression of someone correcting a minor inconvenience. "Will there be more?" she asked. "Unknown," Orvin said. "We've disrupted the coordination signal from this wing. They'll recalculate." "Good," Veleth settled back at her workstation. "I'd like to get back to my cultures." Saren's mouth moved. It might have been a smile. Orvin filed it as expression unclassified. The medical team swept the wing 40 minutes later. No further breach events. The hive coordination signal had not recalculated, or if it had recalculated toward a different objective and away from a wing where 6 units had failed to achieve their target. Orvin suspected the latter. The syndicate was efficient. It did not spend units on objectives that had demonstrated resistance beyond model parameters. He sat in the corridor outside the lab while a technician ran a standard post-engagement scan on his forearm minor plasma scatter, nothing that required treatment. He watched the research wing's emergency lighting cycle back to standard. He listened to his 3 hearts beat in their normal rhythm. Staggered, 2 beat, pause, 1 beat. They had not synced again during the boarding event. He was not sure whether to find that reassuring or not. The convergence in the arena had been involuntary, a physiological response to something his nervous system had classified as genuine shock before his conscious mind caught up. He had expected, somewhere in the corridor and the lab, that it would fire a second time. It had not, which meant either the boarding event had not crossed the threshold that triggered it, or his threshold had shifted. He was not certain which of those possibilities was more unsettling. Saren sat down on the floor of the corridor beside the medical technician's kit, in the spot she had apparently chosen because it was out of the way, and let a second technician scan her hands. The wrapping was still on. She had not removed it before the boarding event, which meant she had been in full close-quarters engagement with the binding tape still in place. This seemed, in retrospect, relevant to something, though he could not determine what. The technician said something to her. She said something back. The technician's ears went flat, a stress response in that species, and then relaxed, and then the technician made a short sound that Orvin's translation filter identified as laughter. He had no idea what they had said. His translation filter was not calibrated for the pitch range. He picked up his slate and opened a new report file. He was not sure how to begin it. He knew what had happened. He had the sequence of events in order. He had timestamps and engagement durations and damage assessments. What he did not have was a category. The Pinnacle Station Combat Evaluation Board had assessed 240 species across 6 cohort cycles and had never once filed a report under unarmored biological threat, kinetic only. The category did not exist. He had checked. He was going to have to invent it. He had started typing the first line when his slate chimed with an incoming administrative update from Submarshal Drevath's terminal. Specialist Hale, S. Classification status. And when combatant, filed 604 pretrial. Board review convening. 72 hours. Mandatory reclassification threshold not yet met. Single trial data insufficient for formal revision. Recommend continued assessment in controlled environment. Orvin read this twice. He read it a third time slowly. The boarding event had not happened as far as Drevath's classification was concerned. It had happened in the research wing. It had happened in the corridor. It had happened on 6 syndicate units rated for hull plate environments. None of this had crossed the threshold because the threshold required a formal board convening, and the convening required 72 hours, and the 72 hours had not started yet. Saren Hale was, at this moment, officially a non-combatant. He set the slate down on his knee. The technician had finished with his arm. The corridor was quiet. He looked at the medical bay down the hall, where the light was still on, and 2 species of technicians were working their way through the post-breach checklist with the focused efficiency of people who preferred problems they could measure. Somewhere in there, Saren had left the tape roll on a bench. He had watched her take it out of her kit bag in the staging area 4 days ago, and he had not seen her put it back. That tape roll was going to mean something. He was increasingly certain of this, though he could not yet say what. He opened his report file again. He wrote, Tactical Assessment, Post-Breach, Research Wing, Pinnacle Station. Date of incident, auto-filled. Classified per standard board protocols, pending formal review. All events herein are submitted for the record. Then he stopped. Because down the corridor, Submarshal Drevath had just sent a second administrative note, this one to the full wing distribution list, and Orvin's slate had chimed with it at the same moment as every other officer on the research wing. All personnel, reminder that reclassification reviews require formal board convening. Informal assessments of personnel performance during non-trial engagements do not constitute evidence for tier revision. Standard protocols apply. Orvin read this one only once. Then he wrote in his private notes rather than the formal report, the board's classification of Specialist Hale as a non-combatant was filed at 0604 4 days ago. It remains active. It was active during the corridor engagement. It was active during the lab engagement. It remains active now. I do not yet know what Earth produces. I am beginning to think this matters more than I assumed. The second breach came at 200. Not Syndicate. The Hive coordination signal had recalculated, as Orvin had predicted, and it had recalculated toward the research wing again, same wing, different entry point. The acid dissolution process had been running on a secondary vent, housing that none of them had located during the first sweep, and at 200 it finished. Orvin heard the alarm from the medical bay, where he had been writing his tactical assessment in the chair beside the technician's station, because the technician's station had the best lighting on this level, and he had not been able to sleep. He was on his feet before the second tone. Saren was already in the corridor. She was wearing the same clothes. No kit bag, no tape. She had apparently slept, or not slept, within reach of a quick exit, and the quick exit had taken her into the corridor before his alarm tone had finished. She looked at him with the baseline expression. "Same wing," she said. "Secondary vent housing, research quadrant. They finished the dissolution while we were clearing the first breach." "How many?" He checked his overlay. 4 units. They've already split, 2 toward the lab, 2 toward the specimen archive. "Archive first," she said. "The sequencer can handle a 2-minute delay. The archive can't. The specimens are in active culture." He had not known that. He added it to the growing list of things he had not known. The archive corridor was narrower than the lab approach, a service passage, low ceiling, designed for maintenance access rather than tactical movement. Orvin had 2 officers with him whose plasma rifles were going to be almost entirely useless in the confined space and the dampening field. He said this to them. They agreed. He told them to take the rear exit and hold the junction in case the 2 lab direction units changed course. That left him and Saren. "You have a plan," he said. It was not a question. "One of them is going to enter through the upper access panel," she said, looking at the ceiling. "The other will take the main passage. If I go in first, the upper access unit will target me instead of the archive door. You cover the passage unit, single point sustained on the barrier, same as before. My output is at 30%. I know 4 minutes on the barrier, don't rush." She went in first. He took his position at the passage mouth and started sustained fire on the barrier of the unit moving through the main passage. His output was degraded. His charge was at 70% from the previous engagement, and the barrier was going to take everything he had to crack. He did not think about what was happening behind him, in the archive, in a space too narrow to move properly, with 1 human and a syndicate unit that had dropped from the ceiling. He thought about his charge indicator and the barrier stress pattern and the exact angle of sustained contact that would maximize heat transfer to the shield emitter. The passage unit's barrier dropped at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He put 4 bolts into it before the charge depleted. 3 connected. The unit went down. He turned around. The archive door was intact. The upper access unit was on the floor of the narrow corridor, its left arm assembly in a configuration that did not match its design specifications. Saren was standing over it, checking. He had learned by now to expect this, her rifle charge indicator. She had not drawn the rifle. She was checking the charge indicator out of what appeared to be habit. "Specimens okay?" he asked. "Should be. The unit didn't get within 2 meters of the culture trays." He looked at the unit on the floor. The arm configuration bothered him in a way he could not immediately account for. The Syndicate built their shock units for environments where resistance would come from energy weapons and mass-based physical force. The arm assembly was rated for hull plate compression. He had read the specifications 3 days ago when he was trying to understand the threat parameters of the first breach. Rated for hull plate compression meant rated for several orders of magnitude more force than a human frame could apply. The arm was in the wrong configuration. He filed this without saying anything. He was building a file of things he was not saying. The medical bay was quiet at 3:30. His charge was depleted. His ceremonial blade had a second bent joint seam, which he considered an adequate evening's work for a tactical analyst. The technician who had scanned him earlier was back on shift, an overnight rotation, and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had expected to be scanning mild plasma scatter and was instead scanning mild plasma scatter for the second time in 12 hours. "Same arm," the technician said. "Different arm," Orvin said. Saren sat on the bench by the secondary equipment station, letting the other technicians scan her hands again. She had been in 2 close-quarters engagements in less than a day. Her hands looked the same as they had in the staging area 4 days ago, the tape still clean, no visible damage to the wrapping. He found this mildly extraordinary, and then on reflection, not surprising, because the holds she applied were designed to put force through the target's structure, not through her own. He looked at the bench. The tape roll was there. She had left it in the medical bay after the first post-breach scan and had apparently not retrieved it, and it was sitting on the equipment station beside a sealed diagnostic kit. The tally marks were face-up. He could see them from where he was sitting, small notations in a script he did not recognize, evenly spaced, running in 2 columns down the worn tape. He looked at them for a while. "What are those?" he asked. She glanced at the tape roll. "Training record." "Oh, techniques, variations, things I need to practice more." She looked back at the technician. "There are a few hundred on there." A few hundred. He thought about what a few hundred technique variations looked like applied in practice. He thought about the archive corridor and the arm assembly in the wrong configuration, and the fact that she had been in an active culture specimen archive at 200 in her regular clothes with no advanced preparation, and had come out having not disturbed a culture tray. He thought about the arena, 19 seconds, 1 opponent. His report had described it as a considered level of effort proportional to the threat presented. He was beginning to revise that assessment. The 72-hour clock started the morning after the second breach. Not because Drevath had updated his classification, he had not. The clock started because Orvin had submitted his tactical assessment of both breach events to the formal record, and the formal record had automatically triggered the mandatory review threshold. The system, unlike Drevath, did not require a human decision to start counting. Orvin reviewed his submitted assessment that morning. He had written it carefully. He had described the corridor engagement, the lab engagement, and the archive engagement in precise sequential order. He had noted the plasma output constraint, the dampening field parameters, the syndicate unit specifications he had been able to verify from open coalition records. He had noted the engagement outcomes. He had noted specifically that in each instance where close quarters contact had been the resolution method, the engaged units had been disabled rather than destroyed. The holds had been released once the units were no longer active threats, and no bystander personnel or protected assets had been damaged. He had written in the section marked Tactical Notes, Supplementary, the following. In the arena trial, the assessed personnel neutralized a Koltari opponent rated at 3 times her body mass in 19 seconds using kinetic technique. In the corridor and lab engagements, she neutralized 6 syndicate shock units rated for energy weapon environments in a dampening field zone where standard plasma output was degraded to 30%. In the archive engagement, she neutralized 1 syndicate unit in a space 2 confined for standard engagement movement. In each instance, she operated at a level of precision that produced no collateral contact with protected assets, personnel, or bystanders. In each instance, she initiated nothing. She responded to engagement once contact was unavoidable. He had not written the next sentence in the formal report. He had written it in his private notes. She did not use everything she had in any of these engagements. I'm not certain how I know this. I know it. He looked at the sentence for a while. Then he left it in his private notes and submitted the formal assessment without it. The 72-hour clock was running. The board would convene. The classification would be reviewed. These were facts, and facts were things he could work with. What he could not work with, sitting at his terminal at 800 with filtered water going cold beside his slate, was the question that had been accumulating since the arena. Not what could she do. He had seen what she could do. The question was different. The question was the one his private note kept circling without landing on. What is Earth? He had her personnel file. He had the biological survey, no natural armament, no toxin glands, mass index 62% of Koltari baseline. He had the combat lineage record, absent as far as the coalition database was concerned. He had the planet designation, which was listed in the survey division registry under a classification he had looked up 3 days ago and had been turning over since. Under review, classification dispute, refer to Galactic Survey Division. Not classified, not unclassified, under review. The entry had a date attached, the date of the last formal assessment, and that date was 8 cycles ago. He was a tactical analyst. He understood what under review for 8 cycles meant in administrative terms. It meant someone had flagged the file, marked it for escalation, and the escalation had not happened yet. It meant the paperwork was somewhere in a queue. He looked at the date again. 8 cycles. At 1100, he went to find her. She was in the secondary exercise space at the end of the research wing corridor, the one that the maintenance rotation used for equipment storage and that had apparently been repurposed, sometime in the last 3 days, into a usable floor space. The equipment had been moved to the walls. She was on the floor doing something with her hands and forearms that he recognized, after a moment, as the slow version of the movement she had used on Grevak. The slow version looked nothing like the fast version except in the geometry of the joints. She was running it at a speed that let him see the mechanics. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. "You practice the slow version," he said. Every time, she did not look up. Speed is a side effect. If the shape is wrong at slow speed, fast speed makes it worse. He thought about the tally marks on the tape roll, a few hundred variations. He thought about the time investment that represented. He thought about the specific word she had used, practice, in the present tense, as an ongoing activity, not a past one. "How long?" he asked. "Since I was 6, she completed the movement and started it again from the beginning. Earth years, we start early." He did not have an immediate response to this. He calculated the implied training period. The result made him stand in the doorway a moment longer than he had planned. "The board convening is in 61 hours, he said finally. "I know. Your classification is still." "I know." He was quiet. She was running the movement again, slower this time, focusing on the wrist position. He could see, at this speed, exactly where the force was supposed to go. He found it remarkable that 310 kilograms of Koltari had found it out at full speed in 19 seconds and apparently had not had time to be surprised. "The survey division entry for Earth," he said carefully. "Your planet's classification. It says under review." She looked up at that. 8 cycles, he said, "the last formal assessment." Her expression shifted, not to surprise, to something that he read, slowly, as recognition, as though this were a piece of information she had expected would surface eventually and was mildly interested to see surface now. "That would be about right," she said. He waited. She went back to the movement. "Ask the survey division," she said. "I'm just from there." He did not ask the survey division. Not yet. The formal request would go through channels, and channels meant time, and the board convening was in 61 hours, and he had enough on his slate without opening a diplomatic inquiry into a contested planetary classification that 8 cycles of administrative process had apparently failed to resolve. What he did instead was pull every public record entry he could find for Earth and read them in order of date. Most of them were brief. Exploratory survey, initial contact, coalition observer status granted, biological census filed. Standard entries for a newly contacted system. The biological census was where the entries became interesting, because the biological census noted, under the category of dominant species, that the dominant species was a grade 4 omnivore with no natural armament and an unusually developed capacity for technological adaptation. Grade 4. Threat tier, minimal. The entry below the biological census, dated 3 cycles later, had been filed by a different surveyor. It noted that the Grade 4 assessment had been conducted on the basis of a coastal survey and that an inland survey had produced data suggesting the Grade 4 classification might require review. The inland survey noted the presence of what the surveyor described as organized kinetic training systems, widespread across the species, age range, early childhood through adulthood, highly varied in form. The surveyor had flagged this for the survey division's attention. The survey division's response, 2 cycles later, was marked received, pending classification review. Orvin read the flagged date. He read the 8-cycle gap. He read the words pending classification review. He looked at his water, which was cold. He had not drunk any of it. There was a third document in the file, which he had almost missed because it was attached to the pending review rather than filed as a standalone entry. It was a note from a survey division analyst 6 cycles ago, marked internal, not for public record. He could access it because the formal review process had assigned his tactical assessment to the same file thread. The note said, "Recommend immediate upward reclassification. Inland survey data strongly suggests the Grade 4 threat tier assessment is based on insufficient sample. The kinetic training systems documented appear to be species-wide, multigenerational, and systematically varied. This is not recreational behavior. Request formal board review at earliest opportunity." The note was 6 cycles old. Nothing had followed it. He put his slate down, he picked it up, he put it down again. His 3 hearts were beating in the staggered rhythm. 2 beat, pause, 1 beat. They had been doing this for the past 20 minutes of reading, and he had assumed it was because he was sitting still and reading was a calm activity. He was no longer certain that was why. Immediate upward reclassification. 6 cycles ago, not forwarded, not actioned. Sitting in a file thread attached to an administrative queue while Seren Hale arrived at Pinnacle Station and was filed as a non-combatant at 6:04, and the board prepared to convene in 61 hours to discuss whether 19 seconds in an arena was sufficient evidence for a formal tier revision. He thought about the tally marks, a few hundred since she was 6. He thought about the survey analyst's note, species-wide, multigenerational, systematically varied. This is not recreational behavior. He opened his private notes and wrote, "If the survey division's recommendation had been processed 6 cycles ago, if the upward reclassification had gone through, what would the board's pretrial assessment have looked like?" He did not write the answer. He knew the answer. The answer was that there would have been no pretrial assessment because the pretrial assessment existed to classify species whose threat tier was unknown. If Earth had been upward reclassified 6 cycles ago, Drevath would have had a different file. The trial would have been structured differently. The classification would not have been filed at 6:04 as non-combatant. 6 cycles of paperwork sitting in a queue, and in the meantime, Seren Hale had been assessed as a non-combatant and filed accordingly and taken down a Koltari fighter in 19 seconds and cleared 6 syndicate units from a dampening field environment and practiced technique variations at 6 in the morning in a repurposed storage room. His 3 hearts synced. The click of his scales was louder than the first time, considerably louder. Korath, who was 2 rooms away, later told him he had heard it through the wall and assumed something had fallen. Orvin sat at his terminal with cold water and 61 hours on the board's clock and a survey division note that was 6 cycles old and had never been acted on. And he understood, with the clarity that the convergence produced, that he was not the only one who had failed to classify Seren Hale correctly. The entire system had done it first.